My marriage to Julian was a beautiful, calculated lie, sustained by his relentless ambition and the wealth I was about to inherit. The illusion shattered one evening when Julian attempted to spike my favorite Cabernet, a cold, calculated move to seize control of my fortune. But in a twist of fate, his quiet sister, Clara, switched the glasses with a split-second, deliberate motion. I watched Julian suffer the consequences of his own malice and realized my life was in danger. What followed wasn't a public outburst, but a slow burn, cold-blooded game where I orchestrated his complete ruin using the very tools he thought he controlled. Silent observation, strategic evidence, and perfect timing. My ultimate victory was not a loud declaration of war. It was the quiet, empowered reclamation of my identity and my life. The California sun, setting over the Pacific, always looked like a lie to me. It painted our mansion in Santa Monica with a veneer of warmth, suggesting a life as golden and effortless as the light itself. But the house, it was a cage. A very beautiful, very expensive cage, secured not by bars, but by a signature on a marriage certificate. My husband, Julian, was the architect of this gilded prison. He specialized in appearances: a sharp suit, a practiced smile, a handshake that promised stability but delivered only ice. He didn't marry me, not really. He married my inheritance. A trust fund that only became fully accessible upon my 30th birthday, and with Julian's signature attached to mine. That birthday had been exactly 2 weeks ago. Before I tell you what happened next, what he tried to do, I have to ask you something. If you've ever felt that gut-wrenching coldness, that silent fear when the person you trust most reveals their true face, if that story resonates, you know how important it is for stories like mine to be heard. Don't let my fear be in vain. Hit that subscribe button right now. Do it before the next twist, before the next shadow. It's a silent promise to me that I wasn't silenced. The night it happened, Julian and I were hosting his sister, Clara. Clara was the ghost in our house. Quiet, observant, almost invisible. She had the same sharp blue eyes as Julian, but where his were cold and calculating, hers seemed sorrowful. She was in town for a visit, Julian claimed, but I always suspected she was there for auditing purposes, ensuring the assets, meaning me, were still in place. We were on the veranda. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the unspoken tension between the three of us. Julian had poured the wine, a deep, heavy Cabernet, my favorite. "A toast," Julian said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "To the next chapter." He raised his glass to mine. His eyes didn't quite meet mine. They were fixed on the wine itself, a fraction too long. I remember the flicker in his left eye. A tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitch I had learned to associate with a lie or a calculation. He placed the glasses on the small, wrought iron table. 2 identical glasses, filled with the same dark liquid. They stood there, side by side, waiting for the toast. And then, the smallest sound, a faint, almost musical clink. I had turned my head for a split second to watch a yacht glide past the coastline. When I looked back, the glasses were exactly where they had been. But the angle, the position, they were fractionally different. Julian reached for the glass nearest him. The one I knew he had poured for me. "Wait," Clara said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. She didn't look at Julian. She looked at me. Her hand, thin and pale, reached out and, with a movement so quick and casual, it was impossible to register as intentional, she picked up both glasses. She looked at the labels, they were all the same. Then she set them back down, but not in the same order. She had switched them. The subtle shift in position, the one I had just noticed, was gone. Julian froze. His smile didn't vanish, but it became brittle, a thin, icy shell. "Clara," he said, his voice tight. "Don't be dramatic. They're both Cabernet." She simply shrugged, that sorrowful look back in her eyes. "My apologies, brother. Just making sure Tina gets the one with the better bouquet." I watched him. His pupils, for a split second, dilated. Fear. Raw, primal fear, instantly masked. He picked up the glass that had been Clara's, the one that was now mine. I picked up the glass that was now his. We toasted. The wine was bitter. More bitter than Cabernet should be. I took a sip. Julian took a large gulp. 10 minutes later, as the sun finally slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a bloody red, Julian's hand started to shake. The glass slipped, shattering on the stone. He clutched his chest, his eyes wide with a terror that wasn't acting. He looked at me, then at Clara. His face, which had been so perfectly composed for years, finally broke. He looked like a man who had stared into a mirror and seen his own death. And then, he ran. He didn't say a word. He just turned, stumbling, and ran into the house. I lowered my glass. The wine was already warm in my hand. I looked at Clara. She didn't blink. She just stared at the house where her brother had vanished. He has 10 minutes before it takes effect, she whispered, her voice colder than the Pacific breeze. We need to talk. Now. What was in that wine? And why was his own sister complicit in his demise? Julian was gone. Not gone, just temporarily incapacitated somewhere in the sprawling belly of our California dream house. Clara and I stood on the veranda, the only witnesses to a crime that had violently boomeranged back onto its perpetrator. The shattered wine glass on the stone floor glittered under the porch lights. A constellation of Julian's immediate failure. It's a succinylcholine derivative, Clara finally said, her voice unnervingly steady as she pointed to the remaining wine in my glass. Fast-acting, non-lethal in that dosage, but it mimics the systemic shutdown of a massive cardiac event or a stroke. I didn't move. My hand still gripped the stem of the glass, now damp with condensation. Succinylcholine. A muscle relaxant. The kind that makes you lose control. The kind that stops your diaphragm from working properly, inducing panic and distress without leaving immediate, easily traceable evidence of foul play. He was going to paralyze you, I whispered. It wasn't a question. It was the icy finality of a lock clicking shut. Not kill me outright, just incapacitate me enough to rush you to the hospital, Clara finished, pulling out a compact digital voice recorder from her clutch. Where he, your distraught husband, would use the emergency clause in your prenup to gain full, immediate signing authority over the liquid assets. While you were too sedated and recovering to fight it. You would look fragile. He would look heroic and decisive. I sank onto a wrought iron chair. The elegant scrollwork digging into my back. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was architectural greed. Every single detail, down to the choice of the drug and the carefully planned hospital narrative, was constructed over time. The bottle he used. He didn't pour it from the cellar stock, Clara continued, her eyes fixed on the entrance where Julian vanished. He brought it himself. From a supplier he used years ago, a black market pharmacologist in Mexico City. I know the contact. Julian was using him for other, less public business dealings years ago. I kept the receipts. She opened a folder on her phone, and I saw scanned invoices detailing massive, undisclosed amounts for research materials dated 6 weeks ago. That's when the plotting must have reached its final stage. The plot wasn't weeks old. It was months in the making. I thought back to the last 6 months. The overly affectionate gestures, the expensive, unnecessary gifts. The constant, subtle probing questions about my trust fund's distribution schedule. I had dismissed it as Julian's typical, slightly tacky exuberance. Now, I saw it for what it was, the performance of a man preparing to destroy his audience. Why now, Clara? My trust fully vested 2 weeks ago. He had access to everything, theoretically. Clara looked away, her mouth a thin, sorrowful line. He needs more than theoretical access, Tina. He needs liquidity, immediacy, and deniability. He's been bleeding the firm dry for years, trying to buy himself out of bad investments. The current financial crisis isn't public yet, but it's coming. He owes close to $50 million to silent partners in Dubai and Shanghai. They aren't patient. He was desperate. She showed me a screenshot of a deeply encrypted ledger. Julian's personal accounts were not only empty, but they showed constant, frantic transfers to shell companies, all marked with loan collateral. The true heart of the betrayal was revealed. He didn't just want my money. He was running from consequences that my money was the only thing standing in the way of. He needed to drain the well before the heat came for him. My heartbreak was not for the lost love. The love had been a flimsy thing, based on mutual ambition and convenience. The heartbreak was for the sheer, cold audacity. For the years I had wasted trusting his ambition, believing in his performance. I wasn't just a spouse. I was a financial instrument, and now, a liability he needed to dispose of. He planned to blame it on a faulty heart condition, I stated, remembering his excessive concern over my imaginary stress. He's been setting the stage for months, asking me if I felt fatigued, if I had chest twinges. Exactly, Clara affirmed. The perfect medical misdiagnosis. He would grieve publicly, sign the papers privately, and pay his debts quietly. You'd become a cautionary tale of a wealthy woman who simply worked herself too hard. A faint, muffled noise, a cry of pain came from inside the house. The sedative was tightening its grip on Julian's system. It was the sound of Julian realizing that he had served himself the consequences meant for me. The greatest betrayal isn't when they lie to your face. It's when you realize the person you slept next to every night was meticulously carving out your financial grave, using your own trust and comfort as the shovel. That's when the heartache curdles into something hard, cold, and immensely powerful. Clara walked to the sliding glass door and looked into the dark, silent hallway. We have maybe 45 minutes before the major effects wear off completely, and he realizes what happened. If he calls the lawyer first, we lose. If he calls the police, he implicates himself. We have to make a choice, Tina. Do we save him, or do we start destroying him right now? The moment of decision arrived. Mercy, or calculated demolition. Destroy him, I stated, the words coming out flat and precise, devoid of heat. There was no internal debate. Heartbreak had calcified into resolve. I was looking at the silent evidence of 5 years of calculated deception, and the only possible response was absolute, surgical retaliation. Clara nodded, her face grimly accepting. Good. Then we analyze the exchange. We need to be able to replicate it, to understand what he saw or didn't see. We walked back to the exact spot on the veranda. The cool night air of California felt like an analgesic on my skin, dulling the shock. I reconstructed the moment in my mind, replaying the short video clip of my memory. Julian had poured the wine first, holding the decanter carefully. He placed glass A, the poisoned one, closest to me, and then glass B, the clean one, closest to him. When I briefly looked away at the sailboat, the fractional shift I noticed was Julian making a final, barely visible micro-adjustment to glass A, ensuring its positioning on the table was optimized for my easy reach. He was ensuring fate, or so he thought. You switched them when you checked the labels, I observed, watching her mimic the action. Not exactly, Clara corrected. I switched them when I picked them up. I didn't check the labels. I checked the temperature. The drugged wine had been sitting on the counter slightly longer, waiting for the right moment, meaning glass A was marginally cooler. When I lifted them, I felt the slight difference. I flipped the orientation as I put them down. He registered the movement, but he didn't register the exchange. He was too focused on the fact that he was still picking up the glass he thought was A, which was now B. The irony was a bitter taste, stronger than the residual Cabernet. His own meticulous nature, his focus on the precise placement of the trap, had blinded him to the possibility of disruption. He had been looking for a flicker in my eyes, not a subtle shift in his sister's hands. Why did you do it, Clara? Why risk yourself? Clara walked to the broken glass shards and looked down, her reflection fragmented in the pieces. It's not about saving you, Tina. Not entirely. It's about denying him his victory. Julian destroyed more than my credit score 10 years ago. He destroyed my life's work, my reputation in the East Coast art world. And he did it with a lie about a missing trust fund, a lie that cost me everything and pushed me to the brink. The money was secondary, she repeated, the intensity of her resentment chilling the air. He used me as a human shield for his first major fraud against my own family. He convinced them I was the one embezzling funds from the estate. The legal fees bankrupted me, but the stain on my character, that's what killed me. When he called me here, supposedly to celebrate your birthday, I knew he was planning a repeat performance but with higher stakes. I wasn't going to let him succeed again. I was paying a 10-year debt. Clara's betrayal wasn't swift. It was a decade in the making. While we talked, the silence from inside the house was punctuated by distress. A strangled cough, heavy and wet. Then, a sound I identified as his favorite leather office chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He's trying to get to his safe, I realized. To the emergency cash, to his phone, maybe. The safe has a 5-digit code, Clara said immediately. His birthday, the year he claims his business succeeded. I know it. We had to be cautious. The sedative was inducing panic, paralysis, and confusion, but it was not permanent. The effects were supposed to be severe enough to require immediate, life-saving measures, which would also necessitate the emergency power of attorney. But without prompt medical attention, the panic alone could be devastating. We heard a heavy, sickening thud. He hadn't made it to the safe. He had fallen. The sound resonated with a certain pathetic finality, the sound of a man crashing to the floor, having ingested his own poison. We need to secure the primary evidence, I said, pointing to the spilled wine. The glass is broken, but the liquid remains. We need proof of the drug and we need the bottle he used. Clara rushed to retrieve a plastic sample bag from her small overnight suitcase. She had come prepared for something, just not this precise scenario. She scraped the wine-soaked stone with meticulous care. Meanwhile, I crept inside. The house was cold and dark. I found Julian lying prone, partially under his desk, his suit jacket rumpled. He was struggling for breath, his eyes wide and unfocused with terror. He was not faking. He was truly terrified. "Julian," I said. My voice dangerously calm, devoid of any sympathy. "What did you drink?" He couldn't speak, but his eyes darted to the discarded, half-empty wine bottle that had rolled behind the bar cart. His body language confirmed it. That was the vessel of the poison. I quickly secured the bottle. As I turned to leave, Julian, with a superhuman effort of paralyzed rage, managed to gasp out one word, a sound torn from his throat: "Clara." He knew, he didn't know why, but in his final moments of coherence, he knew his sister had been the instrument of his downfall. I paused, holding the bottle, and looked down at my husband, the architect of my misery, now crumbling under his own weight. I had the evidence. I had the witness. Now, I had to decide if I would let him live long enough to face the consequences of my revenge. The silent timer was running, and I needed to call 911, but only after Julian's guilt was indelibly sealed. "Clara," I said, stepping back from Julian's paralyzed form. "We need to call 911. Now?" She questioned, gathering the vial of wine sample she had meticulously scraped from the stone. Her eyes were sharp, calculating the timeline. "If we call now, they save him immediately, and he gets control back too quickly." I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the discarded bottle in my hand. "We wait exactly 15 minutes. No more. The drug is non-lethal, but the sheer panic will make him desperate. In that window, the window where he thinks he's dying, he will make a catastrophic mistake. He won't trust the medical system. He'll trust his lawyer, his cleanup crew." We retreated to the soundproof library, Clara setting up her recording device, tuned to capture ambient sound from the office hallway via a small, discreet security microphone she had installed during her previous visit. This was the Cold War of my marriage, a battle waged not with shouts but with surveillance and silence. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. I was watching the consequence of his malice unfold, not with satisfaction, but with a chilling sense of objective necessity. Julian had stripped me of my innocence. I would strip him of his control. We heard a heavy, dragging sound, followed by a grunt. He was still trying to move. Then, a click. He had managed to crawl to his desk, where a landline was mounted low. We heard the frantic, clumsy dialing of numbers. He was struggling against the paralysis, desperate to communicate. He was past the point of calling for immediate health help. He was calling for financial protection. He prioritized ruin over survival. Clara adjusted the recorder. Julian's voice, usually booming and commanding, was distorted by the drug and fear, a ragged, barely audible whisper. "Marcus. Marcus, it's Julian. Listen carefully. Something's gone wrong. The arrangement. It flipped. I took it. I need you to trigger the contingency now. Before Tina recovers. I need the affidavit. The health declaration. End quote. Signed. Immediately. Blame the stress, the heart condition. Tell them I thought she was taking the stress too hard." He descended into a coughing fit, followed by a wet, helpless sound. The conversation was rambling, panicked, but devastatingly incriminating. He confirmed the premeditated nature of the act, the cover-up strategy, and his motive rushing the financial papers. I felt nothing but a profound, settled coldness. The heartbreak was officially over. This recording was not just proof of attempted poisoning. It was undeniable proof of conspiracy and financial fraud planning. The poisoning was a crime of passion, perhaps forgivable by some measure of human weakness. The contingency plan, the immediate attempt to seize assets even while semi-paralyzed, was pure, systemic villainy. He had convicted himself. He believed he was whispering his final instructions. He was actually confessing his final, damning motive. Clara saved the file, marking the timestamp precisely. 15 minutes, she murmured, glancing at the clock on her phone. That was enough. He'll never live this recording down. He proved that even on his deathbed, his priority is greed, not health. The sounds from the office were less frantic now, more like heavy, defeated breathing. The worst of the panic had passed, replaced by the crushing realization that he had failed and was still alive to face the consequences. This was the moment of strategic intervention. I took a deep, deliberate breath, smoothing the fabric of my silk dress, the perfect picture of the distraught, elegant wife. I walked out of the library, retrieved my phone, and dialed 911. My husband, Julian. I think he's had a terrible reaction to the wine. I sobbed convincingly into the phone, pitching my voice high and frantic. He's collapsed. He's struggling to breathe. Please, hurry. I made sure to mention wine. I made sure to sound terrified. I omitted the 15-minute delay and the incriminating phone call. I established the narrative, the accidental tragedy of a loving couple. The sirens began their distant wail over the hills of Santa Monica. Julian's ambulance was coming. As I waited on the patio, the cool breeze washing over me, I looked at Clara. She gave me the smallest, most knowing nod. The physical evidence, the wine, the bottle was secured. The psychological evidence, the recording of his greedy panic, was sealed. Julian was about to enter the hospital, not as the hero who saved his wife's estate but as an unsuspecting patient about to be pursued by a wife who now possessed all the weapons. His rescue was now the beginning of his end. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing lights and forced emotion. I maintained the role of the terrified, devoted wife, clutching Julian's hand as we sped toward the vast medical complex looming over the freeway. He was still semi-paralyzed, his eyes rolling, trying desperately to communicate with the paramedics but failing. He couldn't warn anyone. He couldn't confess. He was trapped in the consequences of his own chemistry. This was the critical phase. The hospital was neutral territory. If Julian's lawyer, Marcus, got to him first, or if the doctors found any irregularity, the fragile structure of my revenge could collapse. I needed to be his primary shield and, simultaneously, his most effective block. As Julian was wheeled into the emergency room, I insisted on staying by his side, using my feigned distress to maintain access. I can't leave him. We're celebrating our anniversary. Please, I have to know he's okay. The performance was Oscar-worthy, fueled by genuine, burning anger. I blocked his phone calls, claiming his lawyer was just adding stress. Any attempt by the hospital to contact family or outside representatives was courteously but firmly channeled through me. Meanwhile, Clara, operating outside the public eye, was dealing with the most crucial evidence. She had the scraped wine sample. I had the bottle Julian had used, sealed in a plastic evidence bag I'd brought from the utility room, claiming it was for the police. I told the attending nurse that the bottle was the only one Julian had drunk from, simplifying the narrative for the hospital. Julian's lawyer, Marcus, a sleek man whose loyalty was bought, not earned, finally arrived, sweeping into the waiting area like a predatory bird. He zeroed in on me, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "Tina, where is Julian's phone? I need to speak to him immediately about these sudden medical issues." I met his gaze, my face a carefully constructed mask of exhaustion and worry. "He's sedated, Marcus. The doctors say he needs absolute rest. I told him you were calling, and he was too stressed. You know Julian's health has been so fragile lately." I lied smoothly, referencing the false narrative Julian had carefully built. Marcus paused, recognizing the script his client had planned. He couldn't fight the distraught wife in a hospital waiting room without looking like a vulture. He backed off, forced to wait. While Julian was undergoing initial tests, Clara slipped into a nearby restroom and, using a portable, pre-prepared lab kit she purchased online, a bizarre necessity when fighting a criminal spouse, ran a basic chemical profile on the wine remnants in the bottle. She messaged me the results, confirmatory positive for a neuromuscular blocking agent. The initial diagnosis of a severe reaction or stroke was intentionally misleading. She confirmed the drug, solidifying our initial hypothesis. My focus, however, was now shifting from evidence collection to preemptive defense. The moment Julian regained full capacity, he would move to invalidate my access to his financial life. I needed to move faster. I told the nurse I needed to retrieve vital insurance documentation from Julian's briefcase, which the paramedics had brought in. In reality, I wasn't looking for health insurance. I was looking for the deep-lying, financial secrets he kept close. I found it, nestled beneath his daily planner, a recently updated life insurance policy. It wasn't the modest one we had signed years ago. This was a massive $20 million term life policy, taken out 6 months prior. The beneficiary was Julian's holding company, which he controlled, and the payout was specifically structured to be maximized if the cause of death was sudden, accidental, or due to unforeseen health complications. My blood ran cold. The intent was never incapacitation. The plan was not to seize my assets while I was recovering. The plan was lethal. The succinylcholine derivative, as Clara noted, was non-lethal in that dosage. But what if Julian had miscalculated the dosage in his panic? Or what if the non-lethal drug was merely meant to mimic a condition that would justify a lack of autopsy or suspicion? The massive insurance policy was the undeniable proof. He wasn't aiming for a legal loophole. He was aiming for a fatal ending that looked like a tragic heart attack under stress. He was going to profit from my death, not just my sedation. The initial heartbreak was replaced by a pure, terrifying venom. I was dealing with a murderer. I replaced the policy carefully, my hands shaking only slightly. Julian was not just a greedy man. He was a desperate, vicious killer who had planned to collect $20 million on my corpse. The coldness I felt intensified, becoming an absolute, frozen resolution. The doctor finally emerged, looking confused. Mr. Thorne is stabilizing rapidly. His cardiac function is improving dramatically. Whatever he ingested, his body seems to be clearing it unusually fast. We're releasing him tomorrow. He looked at me with professional curiosity. Are you sure this was just wine, Mrs. Thorne? His symptoms were quite severe. I smiled, a tight, strained expression. Just a terrible shock, doctor. He hasn't been sleeping. We'll take him home tomorrow. Thank you. As I walked back to the waiting room, I glanced at the closed door where Julian lay. He would wake up tomorrow, free of the drug's effect, believing his plot had simply failed by chance. He would return home to plan his next move. But I knew his ultimate truth, and I now possessed the full blueprint of his destruction. His freedom was the longest leash I could give him before I pulled the trap shut. Julian was discharged the following morning. He looked pale, shaky, and profoundly defeated, but his eyes, though fearful, were already calculating. He scanned the hallway for Marcus, his lawyer. And the expression that crossed his face when he didn't see him was not disappointment, but pure, immediate suspicion. He knew something had gone wrong beyond the simple failure of the drug. I played the role to perfection, the relieved, weary wife. I helped him into the car, murmuring comforting banalities. Clara rode with us, silent and observant, a non-negotiable presence Julian couldn't shake off without looking like an ungrateful brute. The drive back to the mansion felt like traversing the landscape of a dead marriage. The beautiful house was no longer a home, it was a crime scene, a labyrinth of secrets where the last shred of my old self had perished. We got him settled. Julian tried to assert control immediately. Tina, where is my phone? And my briefcase? I need to catch up on work. This attack on my health has put me behind. I handed him his phone, charging, wiped clean of any recent activity beyond the one ambulance call. I told him the briefcase was with the doctors for safekeeping and I would retrieve it later. A small necessary lie to keep the insurance policy out of his immediate access. And the wine, he asked, his voice low, his eyes drilling into mine. The bottle. Did the paramedics take it? I met his gaze, my expression blank, just the right amount of weary confusion. I have no idea, Julian. I was terrified. All I remember is calling 911 and trying to keep you breathing. I think they took everything. Why? Was there something wrong with the wine? He held my gaze for a beat too long, trying to read a confession in my pupils. He found nothing. He found a mask impenetrable, seamless, and completely devoid of the woman he thought he owned. Mini cliffhanger 1. No, he said, finally dropping his eyes. Just expensive. A waste really. He retreated. But the attempt to test me, the immediate move to check on the evidence confirmed his paramount fear. I might know. I immediately initiated the next crucial phase, physical distance. Julian, I said, my voice soft but firm. I cannot sleep in that room. Not yet. I keep reliving you collapsing. The stress is overwhelming. I'm moving into the East Wing guest suite until I can process this. Julian couldn't argue. He needed me to appear fragile, stressed, and medically vulnerable, the perfect setup for his future power grab. He couldn't risk fighting my trauma. He agreed immediately, feigning sympathy. The move to the guest room was the silent funeral for our marriage. I didn't pack photos or mementos. Those had died already. I packed essentials and the most critical items: my copies of the joint tax returns, my passport, and a small burner phone Clara had provided. I was physically moving out of his sphere of immediate control. Alone in the luxurious solitude of the East Wing, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The betrayal had taught me an irreversible lesson. The greatest danger is not external. It is the calculated malice of intimacy. Julian had taken the beautiful concept of trust and corrupted it into a fatal weapon. The anger was still there, a deep, resonant hum, but it was no longer blinding. It was focused energy. It was no longer about screaming or fighting. It was about precise timing. I was rising above him through intelligence, not emotion. My new goal was not loud, public revenge that would validate his drama. My goal was quiet, absolute destruction. I wanted him to lose everything, piece by piece, without ever understanding the identity of the person who pulled the final thread. I wanted him to believe fate, or his own bad karma, had turned against him. Clara, understanding the need for external security, confirmed she had implemented the first phase of her plan: the hiring of a covert, specialized security consultant, not muscle but surveillance and forensics experts. They would monitor Julian's communication, his meetings, and his movements without his knowledge. They were my unseen army, fighting the war he didn't know was raging. That evening, I sat on the unfamiliar balcony of the guest suite, looking out at the endless Pacific. I knew Julian was downstairs, plotting his recovery, thinking he had dodged a bullet and needed only to recalculate the timing of my demise. I smiled, a small, cold, genuine smile. He had no idea the bullet hadn't been dodged. It had simply been pocketed by the person he thought he had paralyzed. He was calculating his next attempt at murder, while I was calculating his financial obituary. The preparation was over. The plan for silent, inevitable ruin was about to begin. In the East Wing guest suite, the planning room had become our sanctuary and our war room. The window overlooking the Pacific was covered. The light was provided only by a desk lamp illuminating whiteboards covered in flowcharts and dates. It looked less like a bedroom and more like the operational headquarters for a hostile corporate takeover. Which, in essence, it was. Clara and I sat across from each other, surrounded by the debris of Julian's life: scanned bank statements, encrypted email logs, and the damning life insurance policy. We were two women forged in the same fire of his deceit. The poisoning is our ultimate leverage. But it's not the primary weapon, I asserted, tapping a marker on the whiteboard. If we go to the police with the evidence, the drugged wine, the recording, it becomes a messy criminal case. He gets a lawyer, he gets bail, and he spins the narrative. He'd argue the recording was coerced, the wine was contaminated. We waste years in court, and my finances remain frozen or exposed. Clara nodded, her analytical mind already ahead of me. Agreed. The poisoning is the insurance policy against his survival. Our weapon is the financial ruin he was trying to outrun. We hit him where he built his life, his reputation, his solvency, his pride. The master plan was solidified into 3 coordinated attacks. Targeting Julian's conservative, high-net-worth clients by exposing his past minor ethical breaches and reckless spending, making him toxic. Using Clara's deep knowledge of his past financial shell companies to anonymously tip off regulatory bodies about historical, systematic fraud. These are crimes he can't run from. Liquidating and protecting my assets. Then triggering clauses that invalidate his access to any remaining joint collateral, leaving him personally liable for his immense debts. We turned to Clara's deep, hidden knowledge. I realized there was still more to her story, more darkness Julian had inflicted. Julian told me you ruined your career through bad investment choices, I said gently. What exactly did he do to your family's estate? Clara took a slow, painful breath. The money wasn't the worst of it, Tina. He created a shell company, the same one he was using for his current offshore accounts. He convinced our parents to invest heavily, promising impossible returns. When it collapsed, he didn't just let me take the fall. He engineered it so that all the communications and transactions appeared to have originated from my personal email and encrypted drives. He didn't just ruin me financially. He convinced my parents that I was a deceitful, inept thief. They cut me off entirely. I lost my inheritance, my reputation, and my family, all at once. He didn't need my money. He needed a scapegoat, and he chose his own sister. Clara pushed a faded, water-stained letter across the table of final bitter correspondence from her father. The depth of Julian's familial cruelty was staggering. His own sister was a practice run for my murder. This revelation solidified our bond. We were not just allies. We were survivors avenging a shared trauma. Clara handed me the critical documents, access codes to his archival business servers and the precise details of his most vulnerable business partner, Mr. Harrington, a wealthy, moralistic investor who prized integrity above all else. Mr. Harrington, Clara explained, pointing to a name on the board. He's the key to the reputational collapse. He hates corruption. If we can anonymously leak Julian's reckless handling of the Harrington deal, the one Julian claimed was his biggest success, it will cost him the client, and the moral fallout will cascade through his entire network. My job was now about timing and performance. I had to maintain the illusion of the stressed, recuperating wife, giving Julian the false security that I was too weak and distracted to fight back. Every conversation, every shared meal, was now a performance designed to lower his guard. I initiated the first strategic legal move. I quietly transferred the ownership of our California home, the same house Julian believed was collateral for his debts, into a complex, irrevocable trust, ensuring that Julian's personal creditors could never seize it. I used a clause in our prenup that Julian himself had written, designed to protect his assets from my bad judgment, which now perfectly protected my assets from his bad judgment. The irony was palpable. He's watching me, Clara, I stated, gathering the documents. He thinks I'm broken. He thinks I'm planning a melodramatic exit. He won't expect a calculated, analytical siege that targets his business spine. I looked at the whiteboard, covered in the maps of Julian's impending ruin. The first domino, the discreet warning about the Harrington deal, was about to be pushed. He thinks I'm afraid of the wine. He doesn't know I'm about to poison his entire career. The stage was set for the first taste of quiet victory. The moment for passive observation was over. The strategy in Chapter 7 was mapped. Now came the subtle, necessary execution. Our first move had to be small enough to appear random, but significant enough to cause Julian to bleed attention and resources. We targeted the Harrington deal, Julian's supposed crown jewel. Harrington is his soft spot, Clara reminded me. Julian built his reputation on landing that account. If he loses Harrington, the perception of his success is shattered. We used an anonymous, untraceable encrypted email service. The message sent to Mr. Harrington's assistant was brief, cryptic, and focused on Julian's tendency to commingle funds, a vague ethical breach that wouldn't hold up in court but would certainly trigger an internal audit by a moralistic client. The effect was immediate. Julian spent the next 2 days chained to his home office, shouting into the phone. He wasn't yelling at me, he was yelling at his own staff, his composure fraying under the sudden, unexpected heat. The paranoia set in rapidly. He couldn't figure out the source of the leak. His mind, conditioned to see the world as a battlefield of self-interest, immediately sought an external enemy, a jealous competitor, a resentful former employee. He never once looked at the fragile, quiet wife who was bringing him tea and feigning worry. My performance was vital. I would periodically check on him, offering a gentle, "You look so stressed, darling. Are you sure you shouldn't just rest?" Every offer of comfort was a subtle twist of the knife, reminding him of the stress that had almost killed him, reinforcing the narrative he himself had created. To further test his paranoia and distract him, Clara suggested planting a small, confusing piece of non-incriminating evidence. I strategically placed an old, archived spreadsheet detailing a long-forgotten, minuscule joint investment in an obscure tech startup on his desk. Julian saw it, seized it, and spent hours trying to decode its meaning. It was meaningless, a phantom, but it diverted his suspicion away from the Harrington crisis and onto some imagined financial conspiracy within his own files. He was hunting ghosts while the real predator was feeding. The stress caused him to make his first financial error. Julian had an upcoming quarterly payment due to one of his silent Dubai partners, a payment he was scrambling to cover after the crisis. In a fit of panic, he decided to divert a large deposit intended for his company's operational expenses to cover the personal debt. It was a clear violation of corporate integrity, a textbook case of fraudulent diversion, but he was desperate and no longer thinking straight. I observed the bank transfer logs via Clara's remote access. The rush of cold satisfaction was immense. He was actively creating the evidence we needed for a Tac 2 regulatory chokehold. He's becoming reckless, Clara noted via an encrypted text message. The panic is overriding his calculation. He fears the client loss more than the fraud. Fear always overrides calculation, I replied. That's why we're targeting the fear, not the facts. The key was to ensure the communication lines between Julian and Mr. Harrington were officially severed. I used my covert security team to anonymously confirm the initial ethical concern to a low-level auditor at Harrington's firm, ensuring the audit would proceed quietly and professionally, without Julian's knowledge. That evening, Julian came home drunk. A first. He usually maintained a veneer of perfect control. He stumbled into the kitchen and started ranting loudly on the phone to an associate about snakes in the garden and traitors trying to sabotage the Harrington money. He never mentioned me. He was still focused entirely on external threats. I stood silently at the top of the stairs, watching him, recognizing this was the breaking point. The veneer of the architect was cracked. The silent power of observation was my greatest defense and his greatest vulnerability. The next morning, Julian's phone rang. I saw the caller ID flash, Mr. Harrington. Julian snatched the phone, trying to sound calm, but his hand was shaking visibly. He walked away to take the call in his office. I heard the muffled, strained tone of his negotiation, then a sudden, jarring slam of the phone receiver. He emerged moments later, his face gray. He walked past me without a word, straight to the wet bar. He had lost the Harrington account. The first, crucial domino had fallen, not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of a prestigious client hanging up. The small victory was achieved. Now, the escalation begins. Julian had lost Harrington. He spent the remainder of the day in a fugue state of drunken denial and impotent rage, pacing the house and occasionally kicking a piece of furniture. The composure he valued so highly was gone, replaced by the raw, panicked vulnerability of a man who realized his control was dissolving. This was the time to strike the major blow: the financial isolation. I contacted my personal, discreet attorney, using the burner phone. I instructed them to immediately liquidate the two largest joint investment accounts Julian and I held, accounts Julian had neglected, believing the capital was too tied up in long-term bonds to be easily accessible. I cited a little-known clause in the founding documents that allowed unilateral liquidation by either party in cases of marital distress leading to financial instability. I was using his own implied financial collapse against him. The liquidation hit his financial life like a tidal wave. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, capital Julian had earmarked as untouchable collateral for his bank loans, were suddenly cash, transferred into my new, protected trust. Julian didn't notice the transfer for nearly 12 hours. His focus was too scattered, still reeling from the loss of Harrington and the phantom spreadsheet Clara and I had planted. When he finally opened his digital asset portfolio the next morning, the scream that ripped from his throat was less angry and more animalistic. He stormed to my East Wing suite, shattering the pretense of our careful separation. His face was blotchy, his eyes wild. The funds. The Fidelity accounts. They're empty. Did you authorize this, Tina? I sat calmly at my dressing table, applying a neutral shade of lipstick. My mask was absolute. Julian, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm barely functioning. Are you sure you haven't moved money yourself? With the Harrington situation, perhaps you transferred capital to cover something? I gently diverted the blame, sowing the seeds of doubt, making him question his own memory and sanity. He searched my face for guilt, but found only serene confusion. His accusation was met with my performance, and the performance won. He left, slamming the door, retreating into a spiral of suspicion that targeted his business partners, his long-suffering chief financial officer, and even the bank itself. He couldn't conceive that the woman who cried during sad movies and needed help opening jars was orchestrating this sophisticated financial siege. The escalation was having the desired psychological effect. He was now operating on pure, irrational paranoia. He began checking his office for wiretaps, demanding his assistants sign absurd non-disclosure agreements, and even fired an old, loyal employee for looking suspicious. This reckless behavior was our greatest asset in building Attack 2. Clara and the security consultant monitored his every move. The diversion of operational funds combined with the liquidations meant Julian had committed textbook fraud and was now attempting to cover his tracks using increasingly frantic and visible means. Clara used the archival server access from Chapter 7 to collect historical evidence of Julian's systematic commingling of personal and client funds. This wasn't one event. This was a pattern of malicious business practice dating back years. We compiled the evidence into an anonymous, perfectly organized dossier, ready to be sent to the State Regulatory Commission. That evening, Julian did something unexpected. He cornered me in the kitchen and didn't accuse me of financial theft but of infidelity. "You're too calm, Tina," he spat. "You're too composed for a woman whose life is falling apart. There's another man, isn't there? Someone helping you?" I simply looked at him, pity freezing in my eyes. "Julian, you tried to poison me. You are facing financial ruin because of your own recklessness, and you think the greatest betrayal I could commit is finding someone else? You're terrified of losing your money, but I already lost my life with you." I walked away, leaving him alone in the brightly lit kitchen, shaking with an anger he couldn't direct. He mistook my composure for love for another man, failing to grasp it was love for my own survival. The following morning, Julian announced he had to fly to New York on an urgent business trip to salvage his key relationships. It was a desperate flight from his collapsing world in California. He was running, not fixing. This was our window. As his plane took off, Clara prepared the final, damning package. The regulatory chokehold was about to be tightened, and Julian would land on the East Coast to find his entire career had been federally flagged. The trap was fully set. Julian's flight to New York gave us a 72-hour window of total operational freedom. While he was airborne, desperately trying to convince his East Coast contacts that the California rumors were just baseless, petty rivalries, Clara and I were finalizing the regulatory dossier. We were working through a mountain of his archived correspondence when I found something that didn't fit the narrative of simple financial ruin. It was a folder marked estate reallocation, tucked deep within an encrypted external drive that only Clara knew the key to. "Clara," I said, holding up the drive. "What is this?" "I thought Julian's crimes against your family were about fraud and scapegoating." Clara stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She looked at the drive, and a deep, raw pain, something I hadn't seen before, crossed her face. "That's the truth he buried," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The truth I almost let destroy me." Clara revealed that the fraudulent scheme 10 years ago was not just about money. It was a psychological weapon aimed at her stability. The core of the scheme involved Julian forging documents that made it appear Clara was attempting to have their aging father declared mentally incompetent to seize control of the trust. Julian didn't just ruin her career. He engineered a situation where she lost her freedom and her fundamental identity. When the estate drama happened, Julian's lawyers convinced the family that my grief over a recent breakup had caused a nervous breakdown, Clara explained, her eyes distant. They admitted me to a private, highly restrictive mental health facility for 6 months, citing severe paranoid tendencies stemming from the attempted legal coup against my father. Julian didn't just sabotage my career. He institutionalized me to secure his lies. The financial ruin was the cover story. The true wound was the complete emotional and professional erasure. She had spent 6 months fighting for her release, only succeeding when she proved Julian had fabricated the key documents. By then, her father had passed away, and Julian had cemented his control over the remaining funds. "I wasn't just paying him back for the money," Clara continued, her voice gaining a steely edge. "I was paying him back for the loss of 6 months of my life, the loss of my sanity, and the loss of my final moments with my father. Every time I saw him with you, Tina, I saw a replica of the cage he built for me. That's why I had to switch the glasses, not just for you, but for the memory of the person he tried to bury alive." The shock hit me hard. I had viewed Clara as a damaged accomplice. Now I saw her as a seasoned warrior, fighting for her very identity. Her quiet demeanor was not subservience. It was the coiled, patient silence of someone who had learned the hard way that open warfare only benefits the manipulators. Our alliance shifted from pragmatic business partners to one forged in the profound empathy of shared victimization by the same architect of malice. "He thought fear was his ultimate tool," I murmured, staring at the drive. He used the most intimate relationships, family, marriage as the means of control. Clara pushed the dossier toward me. Now you understand why the revenge must be absolute. He must lose his credibility, his financial scaffolding, and his freedom. No trial, no fanfare. Just an administrative and legal slow death. We spent the next several hours meticulously cross-referencing Julian's current financial frauds, the funds diversion, the liquidation cover-ups with the historical institutionalization documents. We needed to ensure that when the regulatory bodies investigated the financial crimes, attack too, they would also uncover a pattern of deep psychological manipulation, making Julian toxic on every single level. I used the burner phone to send the full, comprehensive dossier complete with transaction logs, forged documents, and the evidence of the fraudulent diversion to 3 key regulatory commissions: the SEC, the State Bar Association for his lawyer Marcus, who was clearly complicit, and the Federal Trade Commission. The files were encrypted, submitted anonymously through a complex chain of VPNs and proxy servers Clara set up. The submission was silent, invisible, and irreversible. It wasn't a warning shot. It was the final torpedo. Julian was in the air, landing in New York, confident in his ability to charm and lie his way out of his California problems. He was about to receive the shock of his life, discovering that his problems were now the subject of a federal inquiry. Clara leaned back, the tension finally easing from her shoulders. It's done. He will spend the next 3 days fighting government auditors and the fury of his clients. He will be running. And while he is running, we will take the only thing he has left in California: the illusion of control. The financial net had been cast. Now, it was time for the final, devastating pull. Julian was fighting fires in New York, completely unaware that the ground was being hollowed out beneath his expensive shoes in California. The timing of his trip was a gift, granting us the necessary uninterrupted access to finalize the physical and legal fortification of my future, and the irreversible ruin of his. My lawyer, acting under my new, protected trust, completed the transfer of the Santa Monica mansion. It was now fully insulated from any of Julian's imminent debt claims. I then initiated the filing of a petition for dissolution of marriage, officially beginning the divorce proceedings. The papers cited irreconcilable financial distress caused by reckless business practices as the sole grounds. By focusing on his finances, I preemptively established a narrative of victimhood that would be difficult for him to overturn, especially once the regulatory bodies confirmed his fraud. Julian had a small, private emergency safe deposit box at a discreet, downtown bank, which contained physical collateral for his most shadowy debts, including a set of irreplaceable bearer bonds. Clara, leveraging an old, shared power of attorney Julian had never bothered to revoke another example of his habitual oversight, entered the bank. She didn't empty the box. She did something far more devastating. She copied the irreplaceable, legally sensitive documents and then quietly and anonymously sent a letter to the bank's compliance officer, flagging the box's contents for potential money laundering violations. The box was now frozen, its assets untouchable by Julian, and flagged by the authorities. While Clara was at the bank, I received the first piece of feedback from the regulatory agencies. A cryptic coded email from the SEC's automated intake system confirmed that the fraud dossier had been assigned to a lead investigator. The wheels of federal justice were turning. This wasn't local police. This was the methodical, relentless might of the government bureaucracy Julian had always sneered at. The moment Julian landed in New York, he was already facing the regulatory storm. His phone was ringing off the hook, not with clients, but with calls from concerned auditors and, worse, the furious silent partners in Dubai, who had just been alerted to the financial investigation by the internal turbulence. Julian, already paranoid, would interpret the regulatory interest as a direct consequence of his current financial instability, completely missing the fact that it was a targeted attack from his own house. We listened in on the recorded surveillance footage from his office back in California, where his assistant was fielding calls. The sheer volume of incoming stress was palpable. Julian called the office, screaming instructions, trying to locate the now frozen bearer bonds and the collateral he had assumed was safe. He called his lawyer, Marcus, who was suddenly cold and distant. Marcus realized he was caught in the regulatory crosshairs, thanks to our dossier, and was attempting a rapid career-saving retreat. The legal safety net Julian relied upon was dissolving under him. Julian made the mistake we were waiting for. In a desperate attempt to cover the missing $50 million debt and prove solvency, he instructed his staff to sell off a protected portfolio of retirement funds belonging to his senior employees. This was the final, morally bankrupt act. Not only was it illegal, but it would turn his entire staff against him instantly. Clara immediately copied the instruction logs. I finalized the divorce papers, adding the final clause ensuring that Julian would be personally responsible for all debts accrued during the marriage that were now the subject of litigation or regulatory investigation. I was not seeking his remaining assets. I was ensuring he was left with nothing but his liabilities. Julian canceled his New York trip and booked the fastest flight home. He was flying back to a house he no longer legally controlled, a bank account that was empty, and a legal team that had abandoned him. I stood in the mansion. The divorce papers and the secure trust documents stacked neatly on the table. He was coming home to a war zone he had been locked out of, about to become a stranger in his own life. The consequences were now inevitable. Julian's collapse was imminent. Julian arrived back in California 20 hours after his disastrous New York non-trip. He didn't come to the house immediately. He went straight to his downtown office, believing the headquarters of his empire would offer some semblance of control. It offered none. Marcus, Julian's shark lawyer, called Julian the moment he walked into his office, dropping him entirely. Marcus, terrified of the SEC and FTC investigation into fraudulent practices, claimed irreconcilable ethical conflicts stemming from the information in our anonymous dossier. The professional shield was gone. Julian walked into an office where half of his senior team had quit. They had discovered the directive to liquidate their protected retirement funds and, in a collective act of professional vengeance, had reported him to the State Labor Board. The betrayal was complete and internal. His bank informed him his primary corporate accounts were frozen, pending the federal inquiry into suspicious transaction activity and the initial fund diversion. Julian drove home hours later, a defeated man, his face ravaged by exhaustion and dawning horror. He wasn't driving his Ferrari. That was already seized by the bank. He drove a rental, a metaphor for his suddenly transient existence. He walked through the front door of the Santa Monica mansion, expecting the familiar refuge of his ostentatious wealth. Instead, he found me waiting. I was standing in the atrium, dressed in a simple, tailored black suit. Clara stood quietly behind me, an immovable shadow. The house was spotless, clean of his chaos. "Tina," he managed, his voice hoarse, raw with panic. "I need to talk. They're coming for me. You need to sign the power of attorney over to me now. We can save the house, but we have to move fast." He was still commanding, still trying to use me as his tool. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply walked over to the grand piano and picked up the divorce papers. They were waiting on the mahogany surface, visible and undeniable. "The divorce papers are served, Julian," I said, my voice steady and cold. "They cite the financial recklessness that has already caused a federal inquiry. I am protected, and so is the house." He stared at the documents, his face going slack. He hadn't just been betrayed, he had been outmaneuvered in his own domain. "The house?" he stammered, his eyes darting around the expansive room. "It's marital property. You can't touch it." "It was," I corrected calmly. "Until yesterday. I transferred the house into the irrevocable Tina Thorne Family Trust, using the clause you yourself insisted on, protecting the assets from external financial threats and poor judgment. Your lawyer, the one who just dropped you, drafted that clause years ago. The house is legally mine, held in the trust for my future. You are a resident, Julian, not an owner." The realization hit him, the golden cage was now my fortress, and he was the intruder. His eyes finally flicked to Clara, standing silent in the shadows. He understood. It was the moment of full, humiliating clarity. "You," he hissed, pointing a shaking finger at his sister. "You traitorous bitch. This was your doing. You were always jealous." Clara stepped forward, completely unemotional. "I was paying a debt, Julian. The debt of 6 months of my life you stole from me. You chose to poison Tina. I chose to poison your life's work. It's simply the logical consequence of your own methods." The anger vanished, replaced by an immense, crushing despair. Julian realized he was entirely alone, not just financially ruined, but betrayed by the two women he had most deeply underestimated and abused. He had created the perfect team of executioners through his own malice. I handed him a single document, an eviction notice, giving him 24 hours to vacate the premises before my security team escorted him out. You will face the financial consequences of your own making, Julian, I stated, my voice ringing with final authority. The evidence of the wine is secured, but I didn't need it. Your greed and your paranoia did my work for me. You're free to leave, but you are not free to stay. Julian looked at the eviction notice, then at the two women who had orchestrated his silent, complete destruction. He didn't fight. He didn't rage. He simply turned, a broken, defeated shell of the man who had poured the poisoned wine. He was heading straight for his study. He was going to try to salvage whatever leverage he had left. But I knew the only leverage he had ever truly held was the illusion of power. I let him go, knowing his final, desperate move would be his last. After receiving the eviction notice, Julian retreated to his office, the scene of his intended crime and the recording of his confession. I let him go. I didn't need to guard him. His ruin was already signed, sealed, and delivered. The most powerful thing I could do was let him believe he still had time to find a way out. He spent the next hour frantically tearing apart the room, searching for the financial documents, the hidden leverage, or any evidence that might explain the origin of the coordinated attacks. He found nothing. Every document that mattered was either secured in my trust or flagged in a federal dossier. Finally, he emerged, his defeat replaced by a terrifying, uncontrolled fury. He marched straight back to the atrium where I still stood, the picture of serene, implacable power. You did this, he growled, his voice low and vibrating with pure hate. You ruined me. You're a cold, manipulative bitch, Tina. I built this empire, and you tore it down because you were always too weak, too simple to appreciate it. I met his cold glare, unflinching. You tore it down, Julian. I simply stepped out of the way of your self-destruction. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm, his fingers digging in hard. You don't fight fair. You used a lawyer, you used her. He nodded savagely toward Clara. You didn't look me in the eye and tell me what you wanted. You're a coward. You call me a coward because I didn't drink the poison you poured for me? I asked, my voice deadly calm. He released my arm, reeling back as if slapped. The moment I mentioned the poison, the whole dynamic shifted. He knew, now, that the game was over. His composure shattered. The fear of financial ruin was suddenly eclipsed by the raw terror of the attempted murder charge he thought I was holding. In a fit of desperate, self-pitying rage, Julian confessed everything, his voice cracking with the strain of pure defeat. Yes, I did it. I spiked the wine. You were a liability, Tina. A pathetic, emotional burden who stood between me and survival. I deserved that money. I earned this life. And you were going to take it away with your idiotic moral clauses and your inheritance rules. Why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you turn me in then? He demanded to know the mechanism of his defeat, needing to understand why I hadn't used the one piece of evidence that could have jailed him immediately. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit and withdrew the device Clara had set up, the small, compact digital voice recorder. I pressed play. The library filled with Julian's own voice, strained and panicked, talking to Marcus moments after he collapsed. Marcus. Something's gone wrong. The arrangement. It flipped. I took it. I need you to trigger the contingency now. Before Tina recovers. I need the affidavit, the health declaration, signed. The recording cut off. Julian stared at the recorder, his face pale, the audio evidence of his crime echoing in the room he had built. I didn't need the police for attempted murder, Julian, I said, my voice heavy with triumph and disgust. Attempted murder is an emotional, public event. I chose a quiet, slow-burn execution. I let your own words, recorded when you thought you were dying, prove that your intent was not a tragic accident, but premeditated fraud and asset seizure. I let you confess your motive, your greed, not your crime. The SEC and FTC now have a complete, undeniable dossier proving years of systematic fraud, client manipulation, and the illegal diversion of employee funds. You will face the justice of financial ruin and regulatory jail time. That is slower, more painful, and more fitting for the architect of greed that you are. Julian looked at the recorder, then at me. His eyes glazed over. He understood. He had given me the weapon, then he had given me the motive, and finally, he had given me the conviction, all through his own arrogance. He tried one last, desperate grab for power, lunging for the recorder. I was prepared. I simply stepped back, and Clara, moving faster than I had ever seen her, intercepted him with a firm, cold hand on his chest. "No more, Julian. You lost." Julian stumbled back, defeated, his rage spent. He realized I had not only beaten him but done so using his own methods of cold, calculated strategy. He was ruined financially, legally, and psychologically. He turned and ran not to his car but upstairs. He wasn't running from the house, he was running to salvage one last desperate piece of his former life. I had to know what, if anything, he valued more than his freedom. Julian ran upstairs, not to the safety of the East Wing, but to the master suite, the room that symbolized his dominance. I followed him silently, reaching the hallway just as he yanked open the doors of his custom walk-in closet. He wasn't grabbing files or jewelry or even clothes. He was grabbing the small, locked, antique wooden box he kept hidden behind a stack of rarely worn dress shirts. It contained his bearer bonds, his last vestiges of liquid, untraceable wealth, the very assets Clara had flagged at the bank. He was running with the only thing he thought could save him now. He knew the financial police were coming, and his desperate play was to flee the country with his last usable capital. He burst past me, suitcase in hand, eyes wide and focused solely on the exit. He didn't look back at Clara. He didn't look at the house. He was consumed by self-preservation. I had anticipated this. Julian, the planner, always had an exit strategy, but I had preempted that strategy hours ago. When Julian had been in New York, I had anonymously tipped off the California Highway Patrol, CHP, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division about a specific individual, Julian Thorne, who was under federal investigation and was likely to attempt a sudden, urgent flight from the state via the coastal freeway, transporting liquid assets, the bearer bonds. Julian jumped into the rental car, the pathetic symbol of his recent ruin, and sped down the long, sweeping driveway. I walked back to the veranda with Clara, calmly watching the taillights recede down the road toward the Pacific Coast Highway. "Did you tell them about the poisoning?" Clara asked, her eyes narrowed against the setting sun. "No," I said firmly. "That's messy. That's emotional. That gives him a platform to lie, to claim self-defense, or to drag us into years of emotional, public litigation. The financial crime is cold, factual, and undeniable. He ran because he's a thief, not because he's a murderer." We tuned into the local traffic report on the radio. The airwaves were buzzing with an unusual amount of CHP activity around the I-10 corridor, the main artery leading out of Santa Monica. I knew the timing. Julian would hit the freeway on-ramp in precisely 7 minutes. The authorities would be waiting for the car, the known description, and the known motive: flight from federal financial investigation. The phone in my hand vibrated, a coded, untraceable message from the security consultants network, confirming a major traffic stop and asset seizure near the 4th Street on-ramp. I walked over to the shattered pieces of the wine glass, the site of the initial crime 5 days earlier. The glass was gone, swept away, but the memory lingered. Julian thought he had won a reprieve when the glass switched. He thought he could run and leave the memory of his attempted murder behind. The phone call came a minute later from a deputy at the CHP, confirming the arrest of Julian Thorne. "He was attempting to cross state lines, ma'am, and was found in possession of sensitive financial assets under investigation. He's being transferred into federal custody for fraud and attempted flight." Julian was arrested for the thing he was trying to use the poisoning to avoid. He wasn't being charged with attempted murder, which would have put me, the victim, on the stand and forced a painful public airing of the crime. He was being charged with federal financial crimes, the consequence of his own systemic greed. The revenge was complete. It was perfect. It was quiet. Julian would spend years fighting methodical auditors, lawyers who didn't care about his personal drama, and a system that punishes fraud with clinical, unforgiving efficiency. I had avoided the chaos of a murder trial and secured the clean, dignified end to my marriage. The poisoned glass was switched, turning the weapon back on him. He ran from the financial charges, but running only confirmed his guilt to the financial authorities. He was defeated by the symmetry of his own malice. I smiled at Clara. The coldness was dissolving, replaced by a quiet sense of earned liberation. "It's over," I said simply. "The architect has been arrested for destroying his own foundation." We stood together in the silent, magnificent house now wholly mine. The next day, I had a meeting scheduled with the contractor. The work of demolition was done, The work of rebuilding was about to begin. What did a free woman do with a fortress that was once a cage? The house fell into a profound cleansing silence the moment the news of Julian's arrest was confirmed. The tension, which had been a constant, low-frequency hum for months, abruptly vanished. The silence wasn't empty. It was the heavy, settling quiet after a massive storm. I spent the evening not celebrating, but simply walking through the rooms. The air felt cleaner, lighter, free of his ambition and his malice. The house, no longer held hostage by his debts or his darkness, transformed back from a gilded cage into simply a house of vast, beautiful blank canvas. My first act of reclamation was symbolic. I went to the master suite and gathered every photo, every portrait, every single item that bore Julian's mark. His expensive, bespoke suits, his collection of vintage watches, his signed first editions. None of it held any emotional value, only the residue of his toxic ego. I instructed the security team to bag everything and donate it immediately to charity, ensuring no trace of his personal presence remained. The act was surgical, not spiteful. I was erasing the architecture of the life he had built on my foundation. Julian's final, desperate communication came in the form of a heavily redacted message forwarded by the prison administration. A rambling, enraged demand for his antique wooden box containing the bearer bonds. I read the single line of frantic text, his final, pathetic plea for money, and promptly deleted it, unread. His words held no power over me. They were just background noise now. Clara and I sat on the veranda, the same spot where the poisoned wine had been served. The shattered glass was gone, but the memory was sharp. We toasted, not with Cabernet but with sparkling water, a deliberate, silent rejection of the toxic ritual that had defined the beginning of our alliance. "I'm leaving California," Clara announced quietly. "My purpose here is done. The dossier is filed, Julian is arrested. And the truth of his past is now public record for the auditors to find. I can finally start my life without looking over my shoulder." I understood completely. Clara's freedom was contingent on Julian's containment. She had secured her peace. Before she left, Clara handed me a small, beautifully bound notebook. I kept detailed notes on everything Julian did to me: the institutionalization, the forged documents, the emotional abuse. I thought I would need it for a trial. "I want you to have it. It's a testament that you were not the first." And he finally met his consequence. It wasn't just a record of his crimes. It was a record of her survival. An exchange of power between two women who had been defined by one man's malice. I walked Clara to her rental car. She was leaving with very little but leaving free. Watching her drive away felt like the final, definitive cutting of the cord from the past. My final tie to the Thorne family was gone. Now, it was just Tina and the house. I spent the next several days working with my attorney, formally registering the trust, and changing all the locks, access codes, and digital security. I began interviewing interior designers, not to redecorate, but to fundamentally re-architect the space to reflect my taste, my peace, and my independence. I replaced the cold marble in Julian's old office with warm oak. I turned the soundproof library, where we recorded his confession, into a bright, open studio flooded with natural light. I was physically undoing the architecture of his deceit. The work felt like therapy. Every color swatch, every fabric sample, every change was a quiet declaration of autonomy. I was no longer the vessel for his inheritance. I was the owner, the sovereign. The phone rang one afternoon. It was my attorney. "Tina, the divorce is uncontested. Julian has signed the papers from his detention center. He is preoccupied with the federal charges and has waived all claims to the house and your trust. You are officially free." I hung up the phone. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I simply walked over to the newly opened windows, letting the California breeze flood the room. I was divorced, wealthy, and empowered. But I still held one final secret from Julian's attempted crime, a piece of evidence I had chosen not to use but to keep. It was a reminder that my control was not circumstantial. It was absolute. The divorce papers were signed. Julian was formally processed into the federal system, beginning the slow, agonizing, and purely administrative decay of his professional life. The noise was gone. I was left with the echoing clarity of my own thoughts. I sat in the studio that used to be Julian's dark, controlling office, watching the sun set over the Pacific, no longer seeing a lie, but seeing a promise. I reflected on the last few weeks, the transformation from fearful victim to cold strategist. The greatest lesson learned was that power is not loudness. It is calculated silence. Julian's power was external: his money, his suit, his swagger. When I stripped those away, he crumbled. My power was internal: my observation, my ability to compartmentalize the pain, and my timing. That power endures. I never went to the police with the attempted murder charge. It was the correct choice. Had I filed a report, the narrative would have centered on Julian's volatile, personal malice, distracting from the systemic rot of his business. I chose to use the attempted murder as leverage for freedom, not as a tool for vengeance. I used the recording of his panic to convict him of the crime he loved most: financial manipulation. The moral of this long, ugly story is simple: never underestimate the power of the underestimated. Julian dismissed me as fragile, emotional, and wealthy, a perfect target. He never saw the intelligence, the resolve, or the quiet network of support I could cultivate. He focused on the gold in the cage, never on the mind planning the escape. I thought about Clara. She was now traveling, sending me brief, cheerful updates from Europe. She found her peace in freedom and distance. Her presence in my life was the most beautiful, dark twist of fate, an unexpected sisterhood forged in the fire of shared betrayal. Without her instinctive, silent switch of the glasses, I would have been lost. Now, for the final piece of the puzzle, the single secret I guarded from everyone, including my attorney. I went to the small, inconspicuous safe tucked behind a bookshelf in my new studio. I entered the code. Inside, resting on velvet lining, were my mother's favorite pearls, a few investment certificates, and one single, small glass vial. That vial contained the remaining portion of the poisoned Cabernet. After Clara had secured the sample for testing, I had carefully collected a small, clean amount of the drugged wine that had been poured for me, the wine Julian drank. I had kept it sealed, labeled, and protected. I didn't keep it as leverage. I didn't keep it to torment Julian. I kept it as a symbolic reminder of my absolute control. I had the power to destroy him utterly with a single phone call and that vial. Yet I chose to defeat him on my terms, using my mind, not his poison. I chose a quiet victory over a sensational one. The vial was proof that I didn't need the world to validate my pain, or my revenge. The validation came from the freedom I had earned. I walked outside for the final time that evening, standing on the edge of the veranda, looking out over the infinity pool. I opened the vial and, slowly, poured the dark, viscous liquid into the water. The poison mixed with the vast, clean expanse of the water, diluting instantly, rendered completely inert and harmless. I wasn't destroying evidence. I was destroying the symbol of his power over me. His malice was diluted into nothingness, absorbed by my life, which was now too expansive, too clean, and too free to be affected by his poison. I walked back into my house, closing the glass doors. The key turned smoothly in the lock. It was no longer a cage I was locking myself into, but a sanctuary I was protecting. The sun had completely set, and the lights of the city glittered below a vast landscape of opportunity, waiting for the woman who had quietly, ruthlessly, and intelligently won her life back. I was spiked, but I didn't fall. I was betrayed, but I didn't break. The greatest revenge is simply living a life they tried to ensure you wouldn't have. This is my ending. A quiet, empowered victory. And for those of you who've listened to every word, who felt the tension, the pain, the victory, but still haven't subscribed, why? What are you afraid of? Are you afraid of seeing the truth? Go to the comments right now and tell me why you won't subscribe. I want to read the excuses that let darkness win. But if you truly stand with the silently strong, if you believe in justice, then subscribe. Seal the pact. Don't be the silent accomplice to fear.